Because this has become such a contentious issue in the public domain, we have been asked by several persons in the public space and several of the other persons who disseminate news information to try to give some clarity on this entire issue of whether an employer can force or mandate to vaccinate. So, in other words, can employers force employees to be vaccinated in order to work? It's very topical and it's something that needs some clarity. Historically, we must remember that governments can, if they choose, legislate to vaccinate. We have the precedent in Britain, in the UK, the Vaccination Act of 1853, which was put in place to deal with the smallpox epidemic at the time. So, in other words, because there was vaccine hesitancy, vaccine resistance, vaccine reluctance, the UK had to mandate, and they instituted mandatory vaccinations for smallpox by the Vaccination Act of 1853. Now, similarly, and this is more than 150 years ago, there were those who resisted, those who opposed it, and as a result, the UK had to amend the act in 45 years later to make it such that if it is that someone had valid religious or health reasons for not taking the smallpox vaccine, they could advance those reasons and they may be exempted. So it is open to the government of Trinidad and Tobago, if they wish, to mandate vaccinations for Trinidad and Tobago population. But of course, as I said, it's always a touchy issue and it's going to be a flashpoint for discussion and maybe litigation, possibly constitutional motions or applications for judicial review if persons feel that their rights are being infringed by any such legislation. We must, however, remember that even in Trinidad and Tobago, we already have legislation that deals with mandatory vaccination. Let's remember, in terms of school children and those of kindergarten age, those are already covered by requirements for mandatory vaccination in order to be able to attend schools. So we must remember that. And that mandatory legislation in terms of vaccinations for school children, that is to be found in the laws of Trinidad and Tobago if one has regard to the legislation that covers the public health. So let's find that legislation and speak to it now. Under Section 5 of the Public Health, Nursery Schools and Primary Schools Immunization Act, which is to be found in Chapter 2803 of the laws of Trinidad and Tobago, it is made clear that you need to have certain vaccinations and immunizations in order to be able to be admitted to attend classes and to attend school at the primary level and the nursery school level. So in those circumstances, we already have legislation which covers mandatory vaccinations. So we must remember that. So it's not anything totally new or novel in the circumstances. Trinidad and Tobago already has legislation which covers mandatory vaccinations. So if it is that the government wishes to have mandatory vaccinations for the novel coronavirus virus, then it is possible to do so. Of course, that's a choice the government has to make. But as employers can have recourse to the Public Health, the OSHA Act, which deals with the question of safety at the workplace. So an employer may decide that for the safety of his employees and customers, under the provisions of the OSHA Act, which mandate that as an employer you must provide a safe workplace, right? And you look at Section 6 of the Occupational Safety and Health Act, Chapter 8808. In that legislation, it says it shall be the duty of every employer to ensure, as far as is reasonably practicable, the safety, health, and welfare of all his employees. So an employer may use this as his basis or justification to say, look, I need to create a safe workspace for my employees. So therefore, I am mandating that the employees be vaccinated so that they don't infect or affect other employees or the public who has to deal with it. Now, this becomes more interesting and even more topical if your place of work is a public health institution or even a private health institution. And we saw recently in the US where the Supreme Court struck down an application by 187 medical workers at a health facility who insisted that they will not be vaccinated, and they were terminated, and they filed in their local courts the application to overturn the decision of the hospital to terminate them for refusing to be vaccinated. Because the hospital said, listen, this is a health facility, and you, by not being vaccinated, are creating a risk for your fellow workers and more so for our patients. So you must be vaccinated. 187 of the employees at the hospital said they will not be vaccinated, and they were terminated by the hospital. And the courts have thus far upheld that decision by the hospital because they said that the hospital was correct to terminate them for not being vaccinated. So this is a very fluid situation. It's an ongoing situation, and we have to, assess it as we go along. But the point is, there are rights and responsibilities on both sides. There are those who, from an individual perspective, may have recourse to the Equal Opportunities Act and say that an employer is not able to discriminate against a person employed by him. So Section 9 of the Equal Opportunities Act at Chapter 2203 of the Laws of Trinidad and Tobago says, an employer shall not discriminate against a person employed by him. So in other words, some individual workers may say, look, if I'm not vaccinated and you are not rostering me to work, you are discriminating against me. So therefore, they may choose to have recourse there and say, look, this is a breach of the law, a breach of the Equal Opportunities Act by you discriminating against me in that way. And of course, the industrial court has already made it clear in the cases of Communication Workers Union versus National Training Agency, where it said that the terms of employment cannot be changed unilaterally. So in other words, if it is that part of your employment contract did not mandate vaccination in order to operate or to be employed or to keep your job, then what the industrial court has said in Trinidad and Tobago is that you cannot unilaterally change those terms and conditions. Again, in the matter of Communication Workers Union versus Mega Bright Industries, the industrial court again said, introducing new terms and conditions of service with respect to a worker, in order to do so, the principles of good industrial relations require that this be a bilateral process and not a unilateral process. So it's very interesting all around when one looks at it in terms of how these issues are to be balanced. And we have always said, and my personal position is that I think the government ought to use gentle persuasion. In other words, have the advertisements, have the media, use marketing to try to convince the population to willingly volunteer to want to be vaccinated, as opposed to trying to come down with the heavy hand of trying to force the issue, because you can always anticipate and expect resistance once persons feel that they are being forced to try to do this. So the gentle persuasion by way of marketing advertising seems to be the best way to go. However, there are legal rights and responsibilities on both sides, and the individuals can have resort to the Constitution, right, which protects their fundamental rights and freedoms. They can have resort to the Equal Opportunities Act to say that, look, you cannot discriminate against me. But then on the other hand, the employers can say, listen, under the provisions of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, I have a duty to protect my workplace and make sure the workplace is safe. And in so doing, I will insist that persons be vaccinated. And as I said, in a health facility, this is even more critical, and one can understand. And I think the law will stand on the side of an employer, particularly in a health facility, as was done in the USA courts when they upheld the decision of the hospital to terminate 187 of their workers who refused to be vaccinated. However, at the end of the day, the decision is still always available to the government of Trinidad and Tobago if they wish to introduce legislation in order to legislate to vaccinate. And as I said, we have precedent for that in the UK. The smallpox, to deal with the smallpox outbreak, they introduced legislation in 1853 to deal with it. And even in Trinidad and Tobago, we already have legislation on the books that deals with the question of mandatory vaccination in terms of primary school children and nursery school children. And that is under Section 5 of the Public Health, Nursery Schools and Primary Schools Immunization Act, Chapter 2803 of the laws of Trinidad and Tobago. So either way, there are options for the government if they choose to legislate to vaccinate.